In the vast wilderness of the American frontier, where survival often hung by a thread thinner than morning mist, countless stories of courage and tragedy unfolded beneath endless skies. But few tales capture the raw essence of human resilience, like the one that began with smoke rising from what should have been an empty valley, and a Lakota warrior's decision to investigate rather than ride away. Picture this: a seasoned warrior, trained from childhood to read the land like others read books, suddenly stopping his horse at the crest of a hill. Below him, black smoke curls upward from the remains of a settler's wagon. The smart thing would be to avoid whatever violence had occurred there. The safe thing would be to continue his journey home. But something, perhaps the faint sound of crying carried on the wind, or simply the warrior's code that valued life above safety, compelled him to descend into what would become one of the most extraordinary encounters in frontier history. This is not just another tale of conflict between cultures. This is the story of two terrified girls, alone in the wilderness, with death all around them, and the unlikely savior whose appearance should have been their greatest fear, but instead became their only hope. It's a story that challenges everything we think we know, about heroes and enemies, about trust and survival, and about the thin line between civilization and chaos in the untamed American West. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling prairie as Taka Wakan guided his painted horse through the tall grass that whispered secrets to the wind. The Lakota warrior had been traveling for 3 days, returning from a trading expedition with neighboring tribes, his saddlebags heavy with goods that would help his people through the coming winter. The familiar rhythm of his horse's hooves on the packed earth should have been comforting. But something felt wrong in the air today. Taka Wakan was a man who had learned to trust his instincts above all else. At 28 winters, he had survived countless hunts, skirmishes with rival tribes, and the increasingly dangerous encounters with white settlers pushing westward across Lakota lands. His grandfather, a respected medicine man, had taught him to listen not just with his ears but with his entire being. Today, that inner voice whispered warnings he couldn't quite understand. The first sign of trouble came as a scent carried on the morning breeze. Smoke, yes, but not the clean smell of a cooking fire or even a campfire. This was the acrid, bitter smell of burning canvas, wood, and something else he preferred not to identify. His horse sensed it too, ears flicking nervously as they crested a small hill, overlooking a valley that should have been empty. Below them, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, the blackened skeleton of a covered wagon sat like a scar against the golden grass. Even from this distance, Taka Wakan could see that the canvas top had been completely consumed, leaving only the wooden frame and iron fittings. The oxen that would have pulled such a wagon were nowhere to be seen, though dark stains in the grass suggested their fate. What caught his attention most, however, was the thin column of smoke still rising from the wreckage, indicating that whatever had happened here was recent. Every instinct screamed at him to avoid this scene. In recent months, tensions between his people and the increasing number of white settlers had grown dangerous. Wagon trains were often accompanied by soldiers or armed men quick to shoot first and ask questions later. If anyone discovered a Lakota warrior near a destroyed settler wagon, explanations would matter little. The evidence would speak for itself in their minds, regardless of the truth. But as Taka Wakan sat motionless on his horse, scanning the valley for signs of danger, he heard something that changed everything. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of crying drifted up from the destruction below. Not the wailing of adults in grief, but the frightened sobs of children. Without conscious thought, his heels pressed against his horse's flanks and they began their descent into the valley. The scene that greeted him as he drew closer was worse than he had imagined. The wagon had clearly been attacked, but not by his people. The arrows embedded in the wooden framework were of a design he recognized as belonging to a Crow war party, enemies of both the Lakota and the white settlers. The attack had been swift and brutal, leaving little chance for defense. Bodies lay scattered around the wagon's perimeter, but Taka Wakan's attention was immediately drawn to movement near the wagon's rear. 2 figures huddled against the remaining wooden side, and his breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. 2 young girls, one perhaps 12 summers old, the other no more than 8, were pressed against the wagon wheel in terror. The older girl had positioned herself protectively in front of the younger one, and in her trembling hands, she held a pistol that looked impossibly large against her small frame. The weapon was pointed directly at him, though her shaking was so severe that hitting anything would have been a matter of pure chance. The younger girl lay partially behind her sister, and even from a distance, Taka Wakan could see the dark stain of blood spreading across her torn dress. For a long moment, warrior and children stared at each other across the short distance that separated them. Taka Wakan could see the absolute terror in the older girl's eyes, the way she struggled to hold the heavy pistol steady, while tears streamed down her dirt-stained face. He understood immediately that in her mind, he represented the very evil that had destroyed her world. To her, he was just another warrior, come to finish what others had started. Slowly, deliberately, Taka Wakan raised his hands, palms open and empty, showing that he held no weapons. He spoke softly, in what little English he had learned from traders, his voice carrying across the terrible silence that hung over the scene of destruction. "I will not hurt," he said, the words feeling clumsy and strange in his mouth. "I help." The girl's response was immediate and desperate. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "Stay away from us. I'll shoot. I swear I'll shoot." Taka Wakan remained perfectly still, understanding that any sudden movement might cause the frightened child to fire the weapon. Even if she missed, which was likely given her condition, the sound would carry far across the prairie and could attract the very enemies who had committed this atrocity. If they were still in the area, the gunshot would bring them back to finish their terrible work. Instead, he began to dismount slowly, his movements telegraphed and non-threatening. As his feet touched the ground, he noticed details that painted a clearer picture of what had occurred here. The attack had happened at dawn, he estimated, based on the way the bodies had fallen and the state of the fire. The family had been traveling alone, foolishly believing that the tales of increased native attacks were exaggerated. They had paid for that optimism with their lives, all except these two children. The younger girl stirred slightly, and Taka Wakan's heart clenched as he heard her weak voice calling for her mother. The older girl's attention flickered momentarily to her sister, and in that instant of distraction, Taka Wakan saw the extent of the younger child's injuries. She had been struck by an arrow that had passed through her shoulder, and while not immediately fatal, the wound was serious and needed attention soon if infection was to be avoided. "Your sister," Taka Wakan said carefully, pointing gently toward the injured girl. "She hurt bad. Need help." "Don't you touch her!" the older girl shrieked, swinging the pistol back toward him with such force that she nearly lost her grip. "Don't you dare touch her!" But even as she spoke these words, Taka Wakan could see the conflict in her eyes. She was old enough to understand that her sister was badly injured, old enough to know that without help, the wound could kill her. Yet everything she had ever been told about his people warred against the possibility of trusting him. Taka Wakan settled onto his heels, making himself as non-threatening as possible, while still remaining ready to move quickly if necessary. He studied the scene more carefully, noting the way the bodies were positioned, the direction of the arrows, the pattern of the destruction. This had not been a random attack but a deliberate massacre, carried out with the ruthless efficiency of experienced warriors. The Crow war party that had done this would likely return to collect trophies they might have missed in their initial sweep. When they did, they would finish what they had started with these children. Time was running short, and somehow he had to convince a terrified, traumatized girl to trust the very thing she had been taught to fear most. "I know who did this," he said quietly, using simple words he hoped you would understand. "Bad men. Not my people. They come back. We must go." The girl's eyes widened with fresh terror at the thought that the attackers might return. She looked around frantically at the devastation surrounding them, at her injured sister, at the impossible choice she was being forced to make. Trust a stranger who looked exactly like the monsters who had killed her family, or remain here to face those same monsters when they returned. "I don't believe you," she whispered, but her voice lacked the conviction it had held before. "You're all the same. You're all killers." Taka Wakan understood her hatred, even as it cut deep into his soul. He had seen too much death on both sides of this conflict, too much mistrust and violence breeding more mistrust and violence. But in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was two innocent children who would die if he could not find a way to save them. "My name Taka Wakan," he said softly. "What your name?" The question seemed to surprise her. Perhaps she had never considered that the people she had been taught to hate might have names, might be individuals rather than simply faceless threats. She hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Mary," she whispered. "Mary Henderson. And this is Emma." The simple exchange of names seemed to shift something in the air between them. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first tiny crack in the wall of fear and hatred that separated them. Taka Wakan nodded respectfully, as if he had been introduced to her in the parlor of a fine house rather than amid the carnage of a destroyed wagon train. "Mary Henderson," he repeated carefully. "Good name, strong name." He gestured again toward her sister. "Emma need help now. I know medicine. I can help." Mary's grip on the pistol had loosened slightly, though she still kept it pointed in his direction. She looked down at her sister, who had fallen silent in a way that frightened them both. The blood loss and shock were taking their toll, and even a child could see that waiting much longer would mean losing her forever. "If you hurt her," Mary said, her voice breaking, "if you hurt her, I'll kill you. I don't care what happens to me." Taka Wakan nodded solemnly, recognizing the fierce love and desperate courage in her words. "I understand," he said simply. Slowly, watching for any sign that she might fire, he began to move closer to the injured child. With each step, he spoke softly, explaining what he was doing, why he was doing it, keeping his movements slow and predictable. When he finally knelt beside Emma, Mary was close enough that the pistol was nearly touching his chest, but she did not pull the trigger. Up close, Emma's injuries were serious but not fatal if treated properly. The arrow had passed cleanly through the muscle of her shoulder, missing bone and major blood vessels by a miracle. She had lost blood and was deep in shock, but with proper care she would survive. What concerned him more was the fever he could feel beginning to build in her small body. Infection was setting in, and that was a battle that would require more than field medicine to win. As he examined the wound, Emma's eyes fluttered open when she saw his face hovering over her. Instead of screaming as he had expected, she simply stared at him with the solemn curiosity of a child too young to have learned adult prejudices. "Are you an angel?" she whispered, her voice so faint he had to lean closer to hear her. The question struck him like a physical blow. This child, innocent and dying, looked at him and saw not a monster but perhaps salvation. Behind him he heard Mary's sharp intake of breath, and when he glanced back he saw tears streaming down her face as she struggled with emotions too complex for her young mind to process. "No," he said gently to Emma, "just a man who wants to help." And in that moment, watching Mary slowly lower the pistol that had remained pointed at his heart, Taka Wakan made a decision that would change all their lives forever. The delicate trust that had formed between Taka Wakan and Mary remained fragile as spider silk in a storm as he worked to stabilize Emma's condition. Using supplies from his own travel pack and what remained salvageable from the destroyed wagon, he carefully cleaned the arrow wound with water from his water skin, then applied a poultice made from plants he gathered from the nearby creek bed. His grandmother had taught him these healing ways when he was no older than Emma, and now that ancient knowledge might save a life across the cultural divide. Mary watched his every movement with the intensity of a hawk, the pistol now resting in her lap but still within easy reach. She had seen enough death in the past few hours to understand that her sister was in serious trouble, and despite every instinct screaming against it, she found herself hoping that this stranger could somehow work miracles. When Taka Wakan finished wrapping Emma's shoulder with strips torn from his own shirt, the bleeding had stopped, and some color had returned to the little girl's face. "She needs rest and water," he told Mary in his careful English. "But we cannot stay here. Bad men come back before sun high." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of horses carried across the prairie. Mary's face went white with terror, and even Emma, despite her weakness, seemed to sense the danger. Taka Wakan moved swiftly to the crest of the small rise that overlooked their position, keeping low to avoid being seen. What he observed confirmed his worst fears. A war party of 7 Crow warriors was returning to the scene, probably to collect scalps and any valuables they might have missed in their initial attack. They were perhaps a half hour away, moving at a leisurely pace that spoke of confidence that no threats awaited them. They clearly expected to find only bodies when they returned. When he rejoined the girls, Mary read the truth in his expression before he could speak. "They're coming back," she whispered, unconsciously pulling Emma closer to her. "Yes," he confirmed grimly. "We go now. Can Emma ride?" The question posed an almost impossible dilemma. Emma was far too weak to sit a horse on her own, and Mary, despite her brave front, was just a child herself. His own horse was strong and could carry all 3 of them, but traveling that way would be slow and leave obvious tracks that any competent warrior could follow. Yet staying here meant certain death for all of them. "I can try," Emma whispered weakly, showing a courage that reminded Taka Wakan of his own daughter, who lived with his wife's family 2 days' ride to the north. The thought of his own child facing such terror steeled his resolve. Working quickly, he fashioned a makeshift travois from wagon parts and branches, something that would allow Emma to travel while lying down. It was crude, but functional, and it would have to do. As he worked, he explained his plan to Mary in simple terms. "We go to hills," he said, gesturing toward the rocky outcroppings visible in the distance. "Hide there until dark, then travel to safe place." What safe place? Mary asked suspiciously. Your village? So you can take us as prisoners? The accusation stung, but Taka Wakan understood her mistrust. Trading post, he said. 3 days north. White man there. Mackenzie. Good man, he helped you find family. Mary had heard of Mackenzie's post from her father during their journey. It was one of the few places where whites and natives traded peacefully, neutral ground respected by both sides. If they could reach it, she and Emma might actually survive this nightmare. As Taka Wakan lifted Emma onto the travois, securing her as gently as possible, the little girl looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. Will you stay with us? She asked quietly. The simple question contained layers of meaning that struck him deeply. This child, who should have been playing with dolls instead of fighting for her life, was asking not just about immediate protection, but about something deeper. In her innocent way, she was asking if he would become the family she had lost, the protection she would need in a hostile world. I stay, he promised, and meant it completely. With Emma secured on the travois, and Mary riding behind him on his horse, they began their desperate flight toward the distant hills. The travois left a clear trail, but Taka Wakan used every trick his grandfather had taught him to obscure their path. He led them through rocky ground when possible, doubled back through streams, and even drove a small herd of wild horses across their trail to confuse any pursuit. The journey to the hills took most of the morning, and by the time they reached the shelter of the rocks, Emma was delirious with fever and pain. Mary had remained silent during the ride, but Taka Wakan could feel the tension in her small body where she gripped his waist, could sense her fighting not to collapse under the weight of shock and exhaustion. In a hidden cave that offered both shelter and a view of the surrounding country, Taka Wakan made Emma as comfortable as possible with blankets from his pack. The fever worried him more than the wound itself now. Infection was setting in despite his treatment, and without proper medicine, he might lose her anyway. I need to get plants, he told Mary, who had not moved from her sister's side since they stopped. Medicine, plants. You watch Emma. Don't leave us, Mary said quickly, fear flashing in her eyes. I stay close, he assured her. You call, I come fast. While he gathered the specific herbs he needed for a stronger fever medicine, Taka Wakan found himself thinking about the choice he had made. Saving these children would mark him as a traitor to many in his own tribe, just as his appearance had marked him as an enemy to them. The war between his people and the whites was escalating, and mercy was becoming a luxury few could afford. But as he prepared the medicine that might save Emma's life, he thought about his own daughter, about the kind of world he wanted to leave her. A world where children died because of the hatred between adults seemed like no world worth fighting for. Perhaps these two girls represented something more important than the color of their skin or the language they spoke. Perhaps they represented hope itself. When he returned to the cave, he found Mary sitting beside Emma, singing a soft lullaby in a voice cracked with exhaustion and grief. The sight of this brave child, trying to comfort her dying sister, nearly broke his heart. Without a word, he began preparing the fever medicine, grinding herbs between rocks, and mixing them with water heated over a small smokeless fire. What is that? Mary asked suspiciously as he approached with the mixture. Medicine, he said simply. For fever, my grandmother teach me. Mary studied his face for a long moment, and in her eyes he could see her weighing the risk of trusting him against the certainty of losing her sister if she didn't. Finally, she nodded. Getting the bitter medicine into Emma required both of them working together, and for the first time, Taka Wakan felt Mary truly working with him rather than simply enduring his presence. As they managed to get most of the mixture down Emma's throat, their hands touched briefly, and Mary didn't flinch away. Through the afternoon, they took turns watching over Emma and monitoring the approaches to their hiding place. The fever broke near sunset, and the little girl slept peacefully for the first time since the attack. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Mary finally spoke the words that had been building inside her all day. Why are you helping us? She asked quietly. After everything that's happened between our people, why would you save us? Taka Wakan considered his answer carefully. How could he explain to a child the complex emotions that had driven his actions? How could he make her understand that saving them had saved something in himself as well? My people say, Mitakuye Oyasin, he said finally. Mean all my relations. Everything connected, your pain, my pain. Your sister's life, precious as my daughter's life. You have a daughter? Mary asked, surprised. Yes. Her name, Winona. Same age as Emma. For the first time since he had found them, Mary smiled slightly. What does that mean, Winona? Firstborn daughter, he said. Very precious. As full darkness settled over the land, Charred Wagon made another crucial decision. The trading post was still 3 days away, and traveling at night with an injured child would be dangerous, but staying here much longer risked discovery by the war party that was undoubtedly searching for them. They needed allies, and he knew where to find them. We cannot reach trading post alone, he told Mary. Too far. Emma too weak. But I know place closer. My cousin, Red Hawk. He help us. Another Indian? Mary's voice carried renewed fear. Yes, but good man. Like me. Charred Wagon's smile was gentle. He wife, Sarah. White woman. They understand. This revelation stunned Mary. The idea that a white woman could be married to a native, could live safely among his people, challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. If such a thing were possible, perhaps there was hope for understanding between their peoples after all. She was captured, Mary asked. No. She chose. Love stronger than hate. As they prepared for another difficult journey, this time traveling by moonlight toward Red Hawk's village, Mary helped Charred Wagon secure Emma on the travois with a cooperation born of shared purpose. The pistol that had been between them now rested forgotten in the bottom of his pack, no longer needed as a barrier between potential enemies. Charred Wagon, Mary said as they prepared to leave the safety of the cave. Thank you for saving us. For not being what I thought you were. You saved me too, he replied simply. Show me person inside enemy face. Very important lesson. As they emerged into the moonlit landscape, beginning another desperate journey toward an uncertain future, none of them knew that their story would become legend among both peoples. They knew only that they had found in each other something precious and rare, the possibility that understanding could bridge even the deepest divisions, that mercy could triumph over hatred, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could become family. Behind them, the smoldering remains of the wagon gradually faded into darkness. Ahead lay challenges they could barely imagine, but also the promise of a new kind of hope, born from the ashes of tragedy. The journey to Red Hawk's village tested every ounce of strength and determination the unlikely trio possessed. Traveling by night meant navigating by stars and instinct, following game trails, and avoiding the main paths where enemies might lurk. Emma's condition remained precarious, swinging between fevered delirium and periods of frightening weakness that had Mary constantly checking to ensure her sister was still breathing. Charred Wagon pushed them as hard as he dared, knowing that each hour increased the risk of discovery by the Crow war party. The travois he had constructed was crude but effective, though the constant jolting over rough ground clearly caused Emma pain. During their brief rest stops, he would check her bandages and administer small doses of the fever medicine, while Mary held her sister's hand and whispered words of encouragement. As dawn approached on their second night of travel, they finally caught sight of the smoke rising from Red Hawk's village in the distance. The sight should have brought relief, but instead, Charred Wagon felt a new kind of tension building in his chest. Bringing white children into a Lakota village, even one led by his peace-minded cousin, was not without risk. The recent escalation in hostilities had left many of his people bitter and suspicious of all whites, regardless of age or circumstance. There are teepees ahead, Mary observed, her voice tight with fresh anxiety as she spotted the distinctive shapes against the morning sky. My cousin's village, Charred Wagon confirmed. They help us. But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if he was making a promise he couldn't keep. Red Hawk was a good man, but he was also a leader responsible for the safety of his entire village. The decision to harbor white refugees, even children, could have serious consequences for everyone involved. As they approached the village's perimeter, they were met by mounted sentries who recognized Charred Wagon but stared in amazement at his companions. Word of their arrival spread quickly through the camp, and by the time they reached the central area, a crowd had gathered. The expressions on the faces surrounding them ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Mary pressed closer to Charred Wagon's horse, her earlier trust wavering as she found herself surrounded by dozens of people who looked exactly like those who had killed her family. Emma, mercifully, remained unconscious and unaware of the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. Red Hawk emerged from his lodge, a man in his 40s whose face bore the weathered dignity of a leader who had seen too much conflict. His wife Sarah walked beside him, and Mary's eyes widened with amazement as she realized this was indeed a white woman living freely among the Lakota. Sarah's presence gave her hope, but also raised uncomfortable questions about her own future. The conversation between the two cousins took place in rapid Lakota, with gestures and glances towards the girls that Mary couldn't interpret but found deeply unsettling. She understood enough from their expressions to realize that not everyone was pleased with Taka Wakan's decision to bring them here. Finally, Red Hawk approached the horse where Mary sat with Emma cradled in her arms. When he spoke, his English was much better than Taka Wakan's, polished by years of trading negotiations. "Child," he said gravely, "my cousin tells me of great tragedy. I am sorry for your loss." Mary nodded, unsure how to respond to sympathy from someone she had been taught to consider an enemy. Red Hawk studied her for a moment, then continued. "You are welcome in my village as guests under our protection. But you must understand, these are dangerous times. Your presence here puts my people at risk. Some believe you should be returned to your own kind immediately." "The trading post," Mary said quickly. "Taka Wakan said he would take us to Mackenzie's trading post. That was the plan," Red Hawk agreed. "But your sister is very sick. She needs time to heal before such a journey. Sarah will care for her." Sarah stepped forward, and Mary was struck by how completely at home this white woman seemed among the Lakota. Her dress was a mixture of frontier practical and native decoration, and when she smiled at Mary, there was genuine warmth in her eyes. "Don't be afraid, dear," Sarah said softly. "I know this is overwhelming, but these are good people. They saved my life years ago, just as they're saving yours now." Over the following days, Mary watched in fascination as Sarah cared for Emma with a combination of frontier medicine and native healing practices. The fever finally broke completely on the third day, and Emma began to show signs of real recovery. During her sister's healing time, Mary found herself drawn into the daily life of the village in ways she had never imagined possible. The children of the village were initially shy around her, but curiosity eventually overcame caution. Soon she found herself learning simple Lakota phrases while teaching English words in return. The experience was both wonderful and terrifying, as it forced her to confront the humanity of people she had been taught to fear. But the peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. On the fifth day of their stay, scouts brought word that a detachment of cavalry was approaching from the east, clearly searching for something or someone. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Red Hawk called for a council meeting that night, and Mary knew instinctively that she and Emma were the subject of discussion. Through Sarah, who served as translator, she learned that the village was divided. Some wanted to hide the girls until the soldiers passed, believing that protecting innocent children was worth the risk. Others argued that harboring white refugees would only bring more trouble down on their people. "What will happen to us?" Mary asked Sarah as they sat by Emma's bedside that evening. "I don't know, child," Sarah admitted honestly, "but I promise you this. Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." The decision came at dawn when the cavalry patrol was spotted less than a mile from the village. Red Hawk had chosen a middle path that satisfied no one completely, but might preserve both the children's lives and his people's safety. Taka Wakan would take Mary and Emma to a sacred cave in the nearby hills, a place so holy that even enemy tribes wouldn't dare to disturb it. They would remain hidden there until the soldiers moved on, then continue to the trading post. As they prepared for another flight, Emma spoke for the first time since arriving at the village. Her words were directed at Taka Wakan, and they carried a weight that belied her 8 years. "Will we ever be safe?" she asked simply. Taka Wakan knelt beside her, choosing his words carefully. "Safe is something we make," he said, "not something we find. You, me, your sister, we make safe together." The sacred cave was unlike anything Mary had ever seen, filled with ancient paintings and offerings, left by generations of natives seeking spiritual guidance. As they settled in for what might be a long wait, she found herself studying the images on the walls, trying to understand the stories they told. "This one," Taka Wakan said, pointing to a painting that showed figures of different colors standing together around a fire. "Old story. Say one day all people be family. No more war, no more hate." "Do you believe it?" Mary asked. "I believe we choose," he replied. "Every day we choose." 3 days later, when the cavalry had moved on and they finally reached Mackenzie's trading post, Mary faced the hardest choice of her young life. Mackenzie, a gruff but kind Scottish trader, confirmed that he could arrange for them to be taken to relatives in Missouri. They would be safe, fed, and educated among their own people. But as the day of departure approached, Mary realized that leaving Taka Wakan felt like losing another family member. This man who should have been her enemy had become her protector, her teacher, and in many ways the closest thing to a father she had left. "I want to stay," she told Mackenzie one evening. "Emma and me both. We want to stay with Taka Wakan." Mackenzie's weathered face showed his shock. "Child, you can't be serious. You're white. You belong with white people. Why? Mary challenged. Because of the color of my skin? Taka Wakan saved us when our own people couldn't. Sarah found happiness here. Why can't we? The question sparked a debate that involved everyone at the trading post. Some argued that children needed to be raised among their own kind, while others pointed out that Taka Wakan had proven himself a better guardian than many blood relatives might have been. In the end, it was Emma who settled the matter. Having listened to all the arguments with the solemn attention of a child who had seen too much, she made her own declaration. Taka Wakan is our family now, she said simply. Families stay together. The arrangement they worked out was unconventional but practical. Mary and Emma would spend the winter months at the trading post, receiving formal education from Mackenzie's wife, a former schoolteacher. During the summer they would live with Taka Wakan and his family, learning the ways of the land and the skills needed to survive on the frontier. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was one born of love rather than prejudice, of understanding rather than fear. As the years passed, the two girls would grow up bilingual and bicultural, equally at home in a log cabin or a teepee, serving as bridges between worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. Mary would eventually marry a trader of mixed heritage and establish her own trading post that became famous for its fair dealing with all people regardless of background. Emma would become a teacher, educating both white and native children in a school that defied the segregation of its time. But perhaps most importantly, they would tell their story to anyone who would listen, passing down the lesson that Taka Wakan had taught them in that sacred cave. That safety, peace, and family are things we create together, not things we inherit from the accident of birth. Years later, when Mary was asked about that terrible day when her world had been destroyed and rebuilt by an unlikely savior, she would always give the same answer. We think enemies are born, she would say. But the truth is, enemies are made by fear and ignorance. And if enemies can be made, then they can also be unmade. It just takes one person willing to choose love over hate, understanding over fear. Taka Wakan was that person for us. The question is, who will you be that person for? The story of a Lakota warrior who discovered two terrified girls beside a charred wagon became legend in the territory, told and retold around countless fires. But for those who lived it, it was simply the story of how three lost souls found each other in the darkness and chose to become family, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with the simple courage to see the human heart beneath an enemy's face.